The air tasted of copper and cooked meat. Ozone hung thick, a heavy, suffocating blanket over the ruins of Outpost Delta. Silas Vance dragged his left boot through a drift of gray ash. The ash used to be the Western Barracks. It used to be men he knew. Now it was just dust, sticking to the sweat on his face. Silas stopped. He leaned heavily on his plasma robe. He was a space mechanic, a combat engineer for the United Earth Marine Corps. 32 years old, but his bones felt like they had been grinding together for a century. He was lean, built of wire and stubborn muscle, his face smeared with grease and soot. His left hand trembled. It always did when the screaming stopped. 5 years ago, a damaged bulkhead on the cruiser Aegis, a young recruit trapped on the other side. Silas had hesitated, just 3 seconds. He tried to calculate the pressure differential instead of just jamming the door. 3 seconds of doing the math. The recruit's visor cracked. The airlock blew. Silas still saw the kid's eyes every time he closed his own. He gripped the handle of the welder tighter. The trembling didn't stop, but he forced his arm down. The Drachnid swarm had hit them 2 hours ago. A tidal wave of chitin acid and plasma fire. The outpost was gone. The command structure was gone. Silas tapped his earpiece. Static hissed back at him like frying bacon. Then he heard it, not on the radio, in the rubble. A wet, shallow rasp. Silas turned. He limped toward a collapsed command module. The metal was still glowing cherry red at the torn edges. Underneath a massive severed hydraulic leg of an enemy dreadnought, something moved. He dropped to his knees. The heat radiating from the metal baked the skin of his face. He saw a hand, not human. The skin was the color of pale lavender covered in a sheer, high-tech tactical mesh that was torn to ribbons. Silver hair dull with dust fanned out across the dirt. A Valerian, the allied alien forces. They had sent a detachment to hold the ridge. They must have been wiped out too. Silas crawled closer. The woman was trapped beneath 3 tons of dead steel. Her eyes were open. They were the color of storm clouds rolling over the plains. "Don't move," Silas said. His voice was gravel ruined by smoke and dry air. She looked at him. Her breathing was hitched. She whispered. Her voice carried a strange melodic resonance even in pain. Rushed, no feeling below the chest. Silas pulled a handheld scanner from his belt. He ran it over her. The screen blinked red. Severe spinal trauma. Internal bleeding. His earpiece suddenly cracked to life. An automated broadcast from orbit. Code black. Repeat code black. All able-bodied personnel fall back to extraction point Echo. Immobile casualties are to be left behind. Repeat. Leave the immobile. I say again. Leave the immobile. The voice was cold, mathematical. Silas stared at the dirt, his jaw locked. The muscles in his neck pulled tight as steel cables. The Valerian woman heard the broadcast through his earpiece. She closed her eyes. "You have your orders, human. Go." Silas looked at his trembling left hand. He looked at the 3 tons of steel crushing her. He reached up and ripped the earpiece out of his ear. He crushed it under his boot. "I'm fresh out of orders," Vila said. He ignited his plasma welder. The blue flame roared to life, a high-pitched scream that vibrated in his teeth. He adjusted the nozzle to a wide cutting beam. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Working." He jammed the torch into the joint of the dreadnought leg. Sparks showered over his combat armor, biting into his exposed neck. He didn't flinch. He cut through the primary locking hinge. The metal shrieked. The heat was unbearable. His gloves began to smoke. The skin on his knuckles blistered and peeled. He smelled his own flesh burning. He ground his teeth together until a molar cracked. "Stop," she urged, her voice tight. "You are burning yourself." Silas didn't answer. He killed the torch. He shoved his shoulder under the severed beam. He planted his boots in the ash. "On 3, he grunted. "You pull yourself out. 1, 2, 3. He pushed. The veins in his forehead bulged. His scarred back protested, muscles tearing. He roared a guttural sound of pure exertion. The massive steel leg shifted. It rose a foot. The woman dragged herself backward by her elbows. She cleared the drop zone just as Silas's knees buckled. The steel slammed down, burying itself deep in the dirt. Silas collapsed on his back, staring at the smoky sky. His chest heaved. His hands were raw red meat. He rolled over and looked at her. "You okay?" She stared at him, her storm gray eyes wide. She was Kalia, a supreme commander, a royal of the Valerian fleet. She had never seen a creature so fragile push itself so far past the breaking point for a complete stranger. "You destroyed your hands," she said. Silas looked at his blistered palms. He wiped them on his pants, leaving streaks of blood. "They'll heal. Can't fix a crushed chest." He stood up. He walked over to her. He didn't ask permission. He bent down and scooped her into his arms. She gasped as the movement jarred her broken back. "Put me down. I am a tactical liability. The Drachnid hunting parties will track my blood trail." "Let 'em," Silas said. He adjusted her weight against his chest. She was taller than him, and her armor was dense, but she felt strangely light against the gravity of the dead world. He began to walk. The wind picked up, howling through the canyons of twisted metal. It carried the bitter chill of a dying planet. Silas kept his eyes forward. Every step sent a jolt of pain up his spine. His boots crunched rhythmically on the gravel. Kalia watched his face. He wasn't looking at her like a prize. He wasn't looking at her like a burden. He looked like a man hammering a nail. Focused, resolute, empty of everything except the task at hand. "I am Kalia," she said softly. "Silas." "Why did you stay, Silas?" He didn't look down. Left someone behind once, didn't care for the view. They walked for an hour. The sky faded from bruised purple to pitch black. The temperature plummeted. Frost began to form on the edges of Silas's armor. He didn't shiver. He just walked harder. He found what he was looking for at the base of a jagged cliff. An old Alliance bunker, a relic from a border skirmish 20 years ago. The heavy blast doors were half buried in scree. Silas set Kaelia down against a rock. He dug out the rocks with his ruined hands. He found the manual override wheel. He gripped it. The flesh tore on his palms, leaving bloody prints on the rusted iron. He hauled the wheel sideways. The gears groaned, protesting decades of neglect, then finally gave way. The heavy door slid open with a screech. He picked her up again and carried her inside. The bunker was dark, smelling of stale air and old dust. He found the auxiliary breaker and threw the switch. Pale amber emergency lights flickered to life, casting long, strange shadows against the concrete walls. He laid her down gently on a metal workbench. Her combat suit was compromised. The environmental seal was broken where the dreadnought leg had crushed her spine. She was shivering, her lavender skin growing pale in the cold. Silas dropped his pack. He pulled out a roll of heavy-duty space tape, the kind used to patch hull breaches on dropships. "This isn't going to be pretty," he said. "I do not require pretty," Kalia replied, her teeth chattering slightly. He leaned over her. He worked quickly. He tore strips of the heavy tape and sealed the ruptures in her armor. His hands, despite the blisters and the blood, moved with startling precision. He knew how things fit together. He knew how to keep the cold out. He didn't linger on Earthborn. His eyes were entirely professional. When he finished, he stepped back. He reached into his chest rig. He pulled out a single foil-wrapped nutrient block. It was his last one. It tasted like sawdust and dried glue, but it kept a man alive for 2 days. He broke it in half. He looked at the pieces. He gave her the slightly larger piece. He held it out. Kalia looked at the ration, then up at his soot-stained face. "I am a Valerian commander. My metabolism requires different—" "It's calories," Silas interrupted quietly. "Eat." He sat down on the floor with his back against the heavy steel door. He bit into his piece of the ration. He chewed slowly, staring at the far wall. She watched him. She took a bite. It was dry. It tasted like nothing. But as it hit her stomach, the shivering began to subside. "Thank you," she said. Silas just nodded once. He didn't say "you're welcome." He pulled his sidearm from his holster. It was jammed with ash. He began to strip the weapon blindly, his fingers moving purely on muscle memory. The night deepened. The cold outside battered the thick walls of the bunker. Silas didn't sleep. He sat by the door. The amber light caught the hard lines of his face. His left hand, resting on his knee, trembled constantly. A rhythmic, uncontrollable twitch. Around 0300 hours, he set the clean gun down. He reached up and unclasped the heavy ceramic plates of his chest armor. He let them clatter to the floor. Underneath his black undershirt was soaked in sweat and dried blood. He pulled the shirt off. He needed to dress the burns on his shoulder. Kalia was awake. She lay on the workbench, unable to move her lower half, watching him in the dim light. When he turned his back to rummage through his medical kit, she saw it. His back was a tapestry of ball and funds. Thick, ropey scars crisscrossed his spine. Burn marks, shrapnel tears, the brutal geometry of a life spent in the meat grinder of war. He was a canvas of survival. He found a tube of burn salve. He reached awkwardly over his shoulder, trying to smear the gel onto the blistering skin where the dreadnought beam had baked him. He couldn't quite reach the worst of it. He hissed through his teeth, his hand shaking harder. "Come here," Kalia said. Silas stopped. He looked over his shoulder at her. "I cannot walk to you," she said gently. "Come here." Silas stood up. He walked over to the workbench. He handed her the tube of gel. He turned his back to her. Kalia reached out. Her fingers were cool. She smoothed the medicinal gel over the angry red burns on his shoulder. She didn't ask about the old scars. She just tended to the new ones. "Your hand shakes," she observed softly. "Nerves," he lied. "Guilt," she corrected. Silas's jaw tightened. He didn't argue. "You are carrying ghosts, Silas," she said, her voice a low hum in the quiet room. "Ghosts don't weigh anything," he muttered. "They are the heaviest things we carry." She finished applying the gel. She rested her hand on his uninjured shoulder for a brief second, a silent transmission of understanding. "Get some rest, mechanic. You are no good to me, dead." "I don't sleep well on the job," Silas said. He took the gel back, picked up his shirt, and walked back to his post by the door. He sat down. He picked up his rifle. He watched the shadows. Kalia lay back. She was a ruler of millions. She had a fleet of dreadnoughts at her command. But right now her entire world was this cold concrete room, guarded by a broken human who wouldn't close his eyes. For the first time since the ambush, she felt safe. The next morning, the scanner on Silas's wrist beeped a low, urgent warning. He checked the display. Red dots. Swarming. "Drachnid hunting parties," he said, standing up and sliding his armor back on. 5 clicks out, sweeping the grid. Kalia tried to sit up, her face twisted in agony. Her legs remained completely motionless. "I cannot run." Silas walked over to her. "I'll carry you." "No, they are tracking my biometric signature. If you carry me, they will catch us both. If you leave me, you can make it to the extraction zone." "We already had this conversation," Silas said flatly. "I'm not leaving you." He began to look around the bunker, searching for anything useful. A weapon, a vehicle, a tunnel. He pushed open an inner blast door leading to the lower levels. The air inside was completely different. It wasn't stale. It smelled faintly of ozone and crushed flowers. The lights in this room weren't amber. They were a soft, pulsing blue. In the center of the room stood a massive cylindrical chamber. It was made of dark, polished metal and clear crystal. It hummed with a deep, resonant power that made the floor vibrate. Kalia gasped. Silas looked back at her. She had dragged herself to the doorway. "By the ancestors," she breathed. "What is it?" Silas asked, walking up to the glass. "It is a Genesis pod, a Valerian relic. Before the Alliance, before the Great Wars. We built these to heal our most vital leaders." Her eyes were wide. "I thought they were all destroyed." "Can it fix your spine?" "Yes." Silas didn't hesitate. He walked over to the control panel. He couldn't read the alien script, but a mechanic knows a power coupling when he sees one. He found the manual release. He pulled it. The crystal chamber slid open with a soft hiss. Inside it looked like a bed of liquid silver. "I'll put you in," Silas said, moving toward her. "Wait," Kalia said. Her voice was sharp, frantic. "You do not understand. It is not a machine. It is biological. It requires an anchor." Silas stopped. An anchor. "The pod draws on the life force of a healthy host to rebuild the damaged tissue. You must enter the pod with me." "Okay, let's go." He reached down to pick her up. She pushed his hands away. Her storm gray eyes locked onto his brown ones. "Listen to me, Silas Vance. It doesn't just share blood. It shares everything. DNA, neural pathways, memories, pain. If you step into that pod, you will never be just human again. Your mind will touch mine. My burden will become yours. It is a permanent bond." She looked terrified, not of the pod, but of what she was asking him to sacrifice. She was asking for his soul. "We are from different worlds," she whispered. "You do not want the weight of my life." Silas looked at the blinking red dots on his wrist scanner. They were 3 clicks out now. He looked at the heavy steel door. He looked back at Kalia. "I fixed things," Silas said. He reached down, scooped her off the floor, and carried her to the pod. He stepped into the liquid silver. It was warm. It felt like walking into a deep sleep. He laid Kalia down in the center of the chamber. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of awe and profound sorrow. Silas laid down beside her. "I am sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," he said. The crystal lid slid shut, sealing them in the blue light. The liquid rose, covering their bodies. It didn't drown them. It breathed for them. Then the fire started. Silas arched his back as a spike of pure white-hot energy drove into his chest. He couldn't scream. The liquid filled his lungs. Beside him, Kalia's eyes flew wide open. His mind shattered. He was no longer in the bunker. He was standing on a balcony of spun glass looking out over a city of 1,000,000,000 lights. The wind was cold. He felt a crushing weight on his shoulders, the weight of an entire race. He felt the isolation, the lonely meals, the smiles that meant nothing. He felt her, Kalia, the supreme commander who had no friends, only subjects. And she felt him. She was trapped in a metal hallway. Sirens blaring, a heavy iron door sliding shut. She saw the face of a young boy through the reinforced glass. She saw the terror in his eyes. She felt the hesitation. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. The airlock blew. The boy was gone. She felt the soul-crushing guilt that Silas woke up with every single day. She felt the tremor in his left hand. Their traumas collided. The mechanic from Texas and the royal from the stars. The silver liquid around them glowed blindingly bright, weaving their broken pieces together. Her broken spine found strength in his stubborn bones. His trembling hands found stillness in her iron will. It lasted an eternity. It lasted a second. When Silas opened his eyes, the pod was empty of liquid. The crystal lid was open. He took a deep, shuddering breath. The air tasted incredibly sharp. He could smell the ozone from the dead outpost 3 miles away. He could hear the scuttling of drachnid claws on the rocks above the bunker. He sat up. Beside him, Kalia was already sitting. She looked at him. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. He could feel her presence in his mind, not as a voice, but as a warmth at the base of his skull. A quiet, steady hum. She swung her legs over the edge of the pod. She planted her bare feet on the metal floor. She stood up. She didn't fall. Her spine was whole. Silas stood up next to her. He looked down at his left hand. He held it out flat. It was perfectly still. The tremor was gone. He looked in the polished metal reflection of the pin. His brown eyes now had swirling flecks of storm gray in the irises. "You walk," he said. "We walk," she corrected softly. They gathered their gear. The silence between them was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the silence of a shared foxhole. They moved back to the main room. The Drachnid hunting party had passed overhead, missing their biometric signatures thanks to the pod's shielding. They had a window to move. Silas's stomach growled loudly. The sound echoed in the empty room. He walked over to Kalia's discarded tactical pack. He dug through it. He pulled out a sleek silver package covered in Valerian text. "Military ration," he asked, tearing the foil with his teeth. "High-density protein," she said, watching him. "Engineered for maximum endurance." Silas took a massive bite. He started to chew. He stopped. His eyes watered. His face contorted in a grimace of pure revulsion. He swallowed hard, suppressing a gag, and coughed. "Christ," he wheezed, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "What is that?" Kalia tilted her head. "Is it unsatisfactory?" "Unsatisfactory." Silas stared at the gray block of food in his hand. "This tastes like rubber boots soaked in transmission fluid, and then left in the sun for a week." Kalia stared at him. For a moment, her face remained an unreadable mask of royal composure. Then the corners of her mouth twitched. She tried to hold it back, pressing her lips together, but it was useless. A sound broke from her chest, a genuine unpolished snort. And then she laughed. It wasn't a delicate, polite laugh. It was a deep, throaty sound that echoed off the concrete walls. She threw her head back, her silver hair catching the amber light, and laughed until she had to lean against the metal workbench. Silas stood there holding the terrible piece of food. He watched her laugh. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere of the bunker seemed to crack and fall away. The commander, the royal, the alien, it all vanished. She was just a woman finding joy in the middle of hell. A slow, reluctant smile spread across Silas's face. He looked down at the ration, then tossed it into the corner. "I'll cook next time," he said. She wiped a tear from her eye, still chuckling. She looked at him. Really looked at him. The wall of command had crumbled. "I would like that, Silas." The red lights on his wrist scanner beeped again. New targets. Closer this time. The smile faded, but the warmth in his chest remained. He picked up his rifle. He slammed a fresh magazine into the receiver. The weapon felt perfectly balanced in his hands. He felt a surge of tactical awareness that wasn't his own. He knew exactly where the enemy was, how many there were, and how they moved. He glanced at Kalia. She held her energy blade, the plasma humming a deadly blue. She felt his resolve. He felt her courage. "Ready?" Silas asked. "Lead the way, mechanic," she said. They didn't just walk out of the bunker, they moved as one. A single, lethal organism forged in fire and bound by blood. The doors opened and they stepped out into the ash. The ash fell like gray snow. Silas and Kalia stepped out of the bunker and into the ruins of Outpost Delta. The world was dead, painted in shades of charcoal and rusted iron. The wind howled, a bitter, biting force that whipped the ash into blinding swirls. But Silas didn't need his eyes. The Drachnid hunting party was waiting, 6 of them. Hulking masses of obsidian chitin, razor-sharp appendages, and heavy plasma cannons grafted to their insectoid forelimbs. They clicked and hissed, a sound like grinding gears, as they fanned out through the debris. Silas raised his rifle. He didn't aim. He didn't calculate the wind shear or the distance. He just knew. A pulse of calm, cold certainty washed over his brain. It wasn't his thought. It was hers. Kalia moved. She didn't run. She flowed. The royal commander, who had been paralyzed an hour ago, now darted across the jagged terrain with terrifying grace. Her energy blade ignited a brilliant arc of blue plasma that hissed against the falling ash. A Drachnid swung its heavy cannon toward her. Silas pulled the trigger. 3 rounds, center mass. The armor-piercing slug shattered the creature's optical cluster before it could fire. He didn't pause to watch it fall. He was already spinning. His body anticipated an attack from the left flank before his ears even registered the sound of the scuttling claws. He ducked. A massive scythe-like arm cleaved the air exactly where his head had been a fraction of a second prior. Kalia was there. She vaulted off the ruined chassis of a transport truck, flipping in midair. Her blade severed the Drachnid's arm at the joint. As she landed, Silas fired over her shoulder a tight burst that blew the creature's thorax apart. They fought in absolute terrifying silence. No shouted orders, no frantic warnings. Their minds were braided together. When Silas needed to reload, Kalia stepped into his firing line, her blade becoming a shield of spinning light. When Kalia's foot slipped on a patch of slick black blood, Silas was already reaching out to catch her belt, pulling her back into balance while firing his sidearm into the shadows. It was a lethal ballet, the Texas mechanic and the alien royal moving as a single perfect machine. In less than a minute, the clicking stopped. 6 Drachnid warriors lay dead in the ash. Silas lowered his rifle. The barrel was smoking. He was breathing hard, the cold air burning his lungs. The adrenaline was afire in his blood, but it wasn't just his adrenaline. He could feel Kalia's heartbeat hammering against his own ribs. He could feel her thrill of victory, sharp and intoxicating, bleeding into his mind. He looked at her. She stood among the dead, her silver hair whipping in the wind. The blue light of her blade cast harsh, beautiful shadows across her lavender skin. She looked back at him. Her storm gray eyes were wide, dilated with the rush of combat and the overwhelming intimacy of their shared consciousness. "Clear?" Silas grunted, his voice rough. "Clear," she echoed. They needed to keep moving. The gunfire would draw the rest of the swarm. The sky bruised into a deep, violent purple. The temperature dropped sharply as the dead world's rapid night cycle began. The wind turned from a nuisance into a weapon carrying shards of ice that bit into Silas's exposed neck. "Dropship," Silas said, pointing to a massive dark silhouette half buried in the side of a canyon 2 miles away. "An old heavy lifter. Hull looks mostly intact. We can ride out the freeze there." They marched. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind the aching reality of bruised muscles and battered bones. By the time they reached the downed ship, Silas was shivering violently. His combat armor, compromised by the plasma welder earlier, offered little protection against the sub-zero chill. He hauled the rusted side door open. They slipped inside the dark, cavernous cargo hold. It smelled of old engine oil, stale copper, and frozen dust. It was a tomb, but it blocked the wind. Silas sank to the grated floor, his back against the cold steel bulkhead. He pulled his knees to his chest. His teeth chattered a rapid, uncontrollable clicking. Kalia knelt beside him. The Valerian physiology was far more resilient to extreme temperatures, but even she was pale. She reached into her survival pack and pulled out a thermal foil blanket. She unfolded it, a crinkling sound in the dark, and draped it over Silas's shoulders. "Keep it," Silas managed to say through clenched teeth. "You need it." "I am regulating," she said quietly. "You are freezing." Silas shook his head, pushing the foil back toward her. "I'm fine." Kalia didn't argue. She didn't pull rank. She simply crawled under the blanket with him. Silas stiffened. The small space beneath the foil was suddenly suffocatingly close. Kalia pressed her side against his. Her body was a furnace. The heat radiated through his icy tactical shirt, soaking into his shivering muscles. He could smell her. Not the ozone or the blood of the battlefield, but something faint and entirely her own. Rain on hot stone, crushed leaves, body heat. She whispered, her chin resting near his shoulder. "Standard survival protocol." "Yeah," Silas breathed. "Protocol." They sat in the dark, the wind screaming against the metal hull outside. Slowly, the violent shivering in Silas's chest began to subside. The silence between them was heavy, thick, with the unsaid weight of the Genesis pod. Suddenly, a low mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. Outside, a piercing beam of yellow light sliced through the wasps in the dropship's armor plating. An enemy searchlight. A Drachnid dreadnought was prowling the canyon, scanning for survivors. Silas froze. The light swept across the far wall of the cargo hold. The mechanical hum grew louder. A heavy, rhythmic thudding shook the ground. Footsteps. Massive ones. Silas's left hand, resting on the stock of his rifle, began to tremble. It started as a slight vibration, a tapping of his ceramic knuckle against the polymer grip. Then it grew worse. His whole arm shook. The metallic clinking was deafening in the quiet hold. He clamped his right hand over his left wrist, squeezing until his fingers turned white, trying to force the muscle to stop. It wouldn't stop. His breathing turned shallow, ragged. He wasn't in the dropship anymore. He was back on the cruiser Aegis, the red emergency lights flashing, the siren blaring, the face of the 19-year-old kid pressed against the reinforced glass of the airlock door. 3 seconds. He just needed to hit the manual override. But he stopped to look at the pressure gauge. He stopped to do the math. The airlock blew. In the dark of the dropship, Silas squeezed his eyes shut. A low groan of pure agony escaped his throat. Kalia shifted beneath the blanket. She didn't tell him to be quiet. She didn't ask what was wrong, because of the bond she already knew. She was standing in that hallway with him. She was looking at the pressure gauge. She felt the crushing, suffocating weight of his guilt. In the dark, she reached down. Her long, elegant fingers wrapped around his trembling, scarred hand. She didn't squeeze hard. She just held it. "You did the math," Kalia whispered into the dark. Her voice was a soft anchor in the middle of a hurricane. "Because you are an engineer. You protect people by understanding the breaking point of the steel around them." "I hesitated," Silas choked out. "He died because I thought too long." "He died because the bulkhead was shattered by a torpedo," she corrected gently. "You are carrying a debt that was never yours to owe, Silas." The yellow searchlight swept over them again, illuminating the tears cutting clean tracks through the grease on Silas's face. Kalia leaned closer. She pressed her forehead against the side of his neck. "I see you, Silas Vance. See the man who burns his own hands to save a stranger. You are not the 3 seconds you hesitated. You are the man who stayed behind today." Silas swallowed hard. The trembling in his hand finally began to ease. He turned his hand over and laced his thick, calloused fingers through hers. They sat there until the mechanical thudding faded into the howling wind. When morning came, the storm broke. Pale, anemic sunlight filtered through the cracks in the hull. They needed a working communications terminal to send an encrypted ping to the Alliance fleet. The outpost was gone, but this heavy lifter might still have juice in its auxiliary banks. Silas walked over to the cockpit door. It was jammed. He kicked it hard, the metal buckling, and forced it open. The cockpit was a mess of shattered glass and severed wires, but the co-pilot's console was intact. Silas pulled a multi-tool from his belt and knelt beside the terminal. He stripped a bundle of wires with his teeth, twisting the copper ends together. He bypassed the burnt-out fuse and jammed the wires into the primary power coupling. The console flickered. A faint green light glowed on the screen. "Got power," Silas grunted. He tapped the cracked glass keyboard. "But it's locked down. High-level Alliance encryption. I'd need 3 hours and a dedicated slicing rig to crack this." Kalia stepped into the cockpit. "Step aside." Silas looked up, wiping a smear of grease from his cheek. He slid back. Kalia stood before the terminal. She reached up and unclasped the armored gauntlet on her right hand. She took Silas's multi-tool, flipped out the small blade, and without hesitating, pressed it to her palm. A single drop of dark, iridescent purple blood welled up. She pressed her bleeding palm flat against the center of the terminal screen. The machine hummed. The green light vanished, replaced by a blinding, brilliant gold. Intricate Valerian runes spiraled across the display, spinning rapidly before locking into place. A mechanized synthetic voice filled the cockpit, speaking in flawless highborn Valerian, followed immediately by the standard Earth English translation. "Biometric signature confirmed. Welcome, Supreme Heir of the Valerian Dynasty. Fleet Command awaits your orders." Silas went still. The multi-tool slipped from his fingers, clattering loudly against the metal floor. He stared at the golden light reflecting off the cockpit glass. He looked at Kalia, the sheer tactical mesh, the silver hair, the regal posture that he had mistaken for military discipline. He looked down at his own hands. They were stained with black engine grease, old blood and dirt. His knuckles were swollen. His armor was held together with heavy-duty space tape. He was a mechanic from a Dust Bowl town in Texas, a guy who fixed broken pipes and welded bulkheads. She wasn't just a commander, she was the crown. She was the future ruler of half the known galaxy. The air in the small cockpit suddenly felt very thin. The distance between them, which had vanished under the thermal blanket hours ago, snapped back into existence. It wasn't a distance of miles. It was a distance of blood, of class of destiny. Silas slowly stood up. He picked up his rifle. "You didn't say air," he said. His voice was flat, empty. Kalia turned to face him. The golden light painted her face. She saw the shift in his eyes. The immediate walls going up. The mechanic retreating back into his shell. "You didn't ask," she replied, but her voice lacked the cold authority it had yesterday. There was a pleading note in it. "Silas, my title does not change what happened in the Genesis pod. It does not change last night." "It changes everything," Silas said softly. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. "Get your fleet on the horn, Your Highness. Tell them where to pick you up." He turned his back on her and walked out of the cockpit. He stood near the open cargo door, staring out at the desolate landscape. He felt a dull ache in his chest that had nothing to do with his burns. It was the feeling of waking up from a good dream and remembering you were sleeping on the floor. He was a fool. For a few hours, he had forgotten his place. Inside the cockpit, Kalia stared at his retreating back. Her jaw clenched. She punched in a set of coordinates on the golden screen and initiated the distress beacon. They walked the final 3 miles to the designated extraction zone in silence. The storm had passed, leaving a stark, blindingly bright sky. The snow crunched under Silas's heavy boots. Kalia walked a few paces behind him. Through the bond in his mind, he could feel her frustration, a simmering, angry heat, but he blocked it out. He focused on the horizon. He focused on the ground. Keep her alive. Hand her over. Go back to fixing things. As they crested a ridge overlooking a massive impact-cratered valley, Kalia stopped. Silas kept walking for a few steps before he realized she wasn't behind him. He turned around. Kalia was leaning heavily against a jagged spire of black rock. She had dropped her energy blade. Both of her hands were pressed flat against her stomach. Her breath was coming in short, rapid gasps. "What is it?" Silas asked instantly, dropping into a combat crouch, scanning the ridge. "Drachnids." "No," she gasped. She slid down the rock, falling to her knees in the ash. Her face was pale, slick with sudden sweat. Silas ran to her. He dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her. "Where are you hit? I don't see blood." "Not hit," she whispered. She looked up at him. Her storm gray eyes were wide with shock. A different kind of shock. She reached out and grabbed Silas's wrist. She pulled his hand forward and pressed it flat against her abdomen over the armored plating. "Listen," she commanded. Silas frowned. "I can't hear." "Not with your ears, Silas. With the bond. Listen." Silas closed his eyes. He let the mental wall drop. He reached out with his mind, tapping into the neural link that connected them. It hit him like a physical blow. It wasn't her heartbeat. It was a second heartbeat. Frantic, fast. A tiny, powerful drum pulsing in the dark. Silas gasped. His eyes flew open. He stared at her stomach, then up at her face. The trembling returned to his hand, but this time it wasn't from fear. "What?" Silas stammered. "How?" "The Genesis pod." Kalia breathed a mixture of awe and terror in her voice. "It merged our DNA to heal me. It took your human survival instinct, your cellular aggression, and combined it with my Valerian biology." "But it's only been hours," Silas said, his mind spinning. "Valerian pregnancies are fast. But this is adaptation." The pod calculated that we were in a hostile environment. It accelerated the gestation to ensure the survival of the bloodline. Our bloodline. Silas knelt there in the ash. The mechanic. The man who had nothing. The man who believed he was destined to die alone on a rock millions of light years from home. He felt a sudden flash of imagery surge through the bond. It wasn't Kalia's thought. It was coming from the child. A pure, instinctual projection. He saw a boy. He had Kalia's proud, sharp jawline and her storm gray eyes, but his hair was a messy shock of human brown, and he had Silas's crooked smile. The breath caught in Silas's throat. Something ancient and fierce ignited in his chest. The grease, the dirt, the titles, the crowns, it all burned away to ash. "I'm going to be a father," Silas whispered. Kalia managed a weak, exhausted smile. "It appears so." The ground suddenly shook. A shadow fell over them. Silas looked up. A massive ship was descending through the clouds, but it wasn't a Drachnid dreadnought. It was a sleek silver vessel. The engines glowed with clean blue Alliance plasma. The hull bore the insignia of the United Earth Command, intertwined with the golden crest of the Valerian Royal Fleet. Rescue. The ship hovered over the valley, kicking up a massive cloud of ash and snow. A heavy ramp lowered slowly to the ground. Silas stood up. He reached down and helped Kalia to her feet. He put his arm around her waist, supporting her weight. The tension between them was gone, replaced by a fierce, singular protective instinct. Figures emerged from the smoke at the bottom of the ramp. 5 heavily armored Union shock troopers. They carried assault rifles, their faces hidden behind black visors. Behind them walked 2 figures. One was an older human male in the crisp, immaculate uniform of an Alliance general, General Thorn. The other was a tall Valerian elder draped in the heavy crimson robes of the high priesthood. Silas let out a breath of relief. "We made it." He raised his free hand to wave. The 5 shock troopers raised their rifles. They didn't aim at the perimeter. They aimed directly at Silas's chest. Silas froze. His hand dropped slowly to the grip of his rifle. He stepped slightly in front of Kalia. General Thorne stepped forward, his boots crunching on the ash. His face was a mask of cold, bureaucratic calculation. "Stand down, mechanic," Thorne's voice echoed over an amplifier. "General," Silas shouted over the roar of the engines, "Commander Kalia is injured. We need immediate medical evac." The Valerian high priest spoke next. His voice dripped with contempt. "The air will be secured, human. You, however, will remain exactly where you are." Kalia stiffened against Silas. She pushed herself upright. "High Priest Valerius, General Thorn, lower your weapons immediately. This man saved my life. He is under my royal protection." Thorn adjusted his cuffs, unbothered by the command. "With respect, Your Highness, we have been monitoring your biometric telemetry since the distress beacon was activated." The high priest pointed a long, bony finger at Kalia's stomach. "You entered a sacred Genesis pod with a base-born human. Your biological readings are catastrophic. You are carrying a genetic contaminant, an anomaly that threatens the purity of the dynasty. Silas's blood turned to ice. He understood immediately. They didn't come to rescue them. They came to cover up a scandal. A human mechanic had bonded with the supreme heir. And worse, they had created a hybrid, a child that possessed the raw, aggressive survival traits of humanity and the immense psychic and technological power of the Valerian royals. The child wasn't a miracle to them. It was a threat to the established order. It was a weapon they couldn't control. The anomaly will be extracted and studied, General Thorne said flatly. The heir will be cleansed of the human neural link. And you, Vance. Thorne looked at Silas like he was looking at a stain on his boot. You died defending Outpost Delta, a tragic hero. Kalia's hand went to her energy blade. Her storm gray eyes darkened with a terrifying ancient fury. If any of you take one step toward my child, I will burn your fleet from the sky. Thorne sighed. He raised two fingers. The shock troopers clicked off their safeties. Take the heir alive, Thorne ordered. Kill the mechanic. Silas didn't hesitate. He didn't think. The 3 seconds of doubt that had haunted him for 5 years were entirely gone. He shoved Kalia hard behind the jagged black rock. He didn't seek cover for himself. He stepped out into the open planting, his heavy boots in the ash. He raised his combat rifle. His left hand gripped the barrel. It was perfectly, entirely still. He looked at the rifles pointed at his heart. He felt a terrifying, beautiful pulse of life beating against his mind. Silas Vance pulled the trigger. The rifle kicked against Silas's shoulder. Hard, familiar. A 3-round burst of depleted uranium tore through the freezing air. The lead Union shock trooper didn't even have time to register the mechanic's defiance. The heavy slug shattered the trooper's black visor, snapping his head back. In a spray of red and shattered polymer, he dropped like a stone in the ash. Before the echo of the gunshot even rolled across the valley, Silas was already moving. He didn't run away. He charged forward. Through the neurobond, he felt Kylia's shock instantly swallowed by a surge of pure predatory Valerian battle rage. She didn't seek the cover of the black rock. She pushed off it. The remaining 4 troopers raised their weapons. They were elite, genetically enhanced, trained to put down rebellions on a dozen worlds. But they were fighting 2 people who shared one mind. Silas slid on his knees through the gray snow. He fired blindly upward, not needing to look. Kalia was already in the air above him. His covering fire forced the troopers to flinch, their plasma bolts searing the space where Silas had been a fraction of a second before. Kalia landed in the center of their formation. Her energy blade was a blur of screaming blue light. She moved with a devastating, fluid grace. A lethal dance choreographed by the mechanic's tactical awareness. Silas saw a trooper flanking her blind spot. He didn't shout. He just fed the impulse through the bond. Kalia spun, ducking a rifle butt, and drove her blade through the trooper's chest plate. Silas was back on his feet. He drove the steel stock of his rifle into the throat of the 3rd trooper, hearing the satisfying crunch of cartilage. He pulled his sidearm with his right hand, firing point blank into the gap of the falling man's armor. The last trooper backpedaled, raising his weapon toward Kalia's exposed back. Silas didn't have a shot. He threw his empty sidearm. The heavy chunk of metal caught the trooper squarely in the visor, staggering him. Kalia didn't even turn around. She simply thrust her blade backward, impaling him. Silence fell over the landing zone. It had taken less than 12 seconds. General Thorne stood near the base of the dropship ramp. The pristine polish of his boots was now dusted with ash. He stared at the 5 dead elite soldiers, his jaw tight. Beside him, High Priest Valerius looked completely unbothered. His ancient eyes narrowed in cold calculation. Impressive, Thorne said, his voice carrying over the wind. The anomaly enhances your combat efficiency. A fascinating data point. But you are out of ammunition, Vance. And you are out of time. Thorne raised his wrist comms. Gunship Alpha, suppressing fire on the LZ, tear them apart. Above the clouds, the massive cannons of the Alliance dropship whined as they charged. A deep bass vibration rattled the fillings in Silas's teeth. Move! Silas roared, grabbing Kalia's hand. They ran, the sky tore open. Pillars of white-hot plasma slammed into the valley floor. The earth superheated, turning the ash into flying slag. Silas threw himself over Kalia, tackling her down into a deep impact crater just as a blast vaporized the black rock they had been standing near. The heat washed over them, singeing Silas's hair and blistering the exposed skin on his neck. He coughed, his lungs burning with ozone and pulverized dirt. "We can't fight a cruiser with a crowbar." "The bunker," Kalia gasped. She was clutching her stomach again. The physical toll of the combat, combined with the impossible speed of her pregnancy, was draining the color from her face. Her lavender skin was pale, almost translucent. "Lower levels. We have to go deep." Silas hauled her up. They scrambled out of the crater, running a serpentine pattern through the ruins as the dropship's cannons tracked them, tearing the dead world to pieces behind their heels. They reached the heavy steel doors of the old Alliance bunker. Silas hit the manual override, the gears screaming, as the thick metal slid open just enough for them to slip inside. He slammed his weight against the wheel, spinning it the other way, locking the deadbolts just as a plasma bolt struck the exterior. The blast doors glowed a dull, angry red, but they held. They were in the dark again. The amber emergency lights flickered, struggling to stay alive under the assault from above. Silas slumped against the wall, sliding down to the cold concrete floor. He was bleeding from a dozen small shrapnel cuts. His chest heaved. Kalia didn't sit. She collapsed. Silas caught her before she hit the floor. He laid her down gently. She was trembling violently, her skin slick with a cold sweat. Her breathing was ragged, shallow. "Kalia," Silas said, pulling off his gloves, his blistered hands hovering over her. "Talk to me." "It is too fast," she whispered. Her eyes squeezed shut. The pod initiated the sequence, but the energy required. "It is drawing from my reserves. My core temperature is dropping." Through the bond, Silas felt it. It wasn't just a physical strain. It was a massive, overwhelming draw of bioelectric energy. The child was developing at an exponential rate, building a complex Valerian neural network using the aggressive building blocks of human DNA. It was a miracle, and it was killing her. "I need to get you back in the pod," Silas said, starting to lift her. "No," we're saying. She grabbed his collar. Her grip was startlingly weak. "The pod is empty. The ambient energy is spent. It cannot help us now." A massive boom shook the bunker. Dust rained down from the ceiling. Silas looked up. "Thorne is bringing up the heavy breaching charges. We have maybe 10 minutes before they blow those doors." He looked around the dimly lit room. He was a mechanic. Give him a broken engine, a ruptured fuel line, a shattered hull, and he could fix it. But he couldn't fix this. He couldn't weld her strength back. He felt a deep, twisting panic rising in his throat. It tasted like ashes and copper. He looked at Kalia, the Supreme Commander, the woman who had laughed at his terrible food, the mother of the child beating against his mind. "I won't let them touch you," he said. His voice was a low, jagged rasp. He stood up. He walked over to the bunker's main terminal. The screen was dead shattered during the firefight years ago. He pulled the heavy wrench from his belt. He smashed the casing open, exposing the main power feeds. He didn't know Valerian code. He didn't have high-level Alliance clearance. But he knew how electricity worked. He knew how to make things bleed power. He grabbed the thick, insulated main trunk line with both hands. He didn't use the multi-tool. He used pure, raw strength, tearing the protective sheathing away to expose the thick copper core. "Silas, what are you doing, eh?" Kalia gasped from the floor. "Buying time." He grabbed the auxiliary lines running to the bunker's exterior defense grid, the automated turrets, the anti-air batteries. They had been offline for 20 years, their targeting computers fried by an old EMP. Silas didn't need the computers. He just needed the guns. He twisted the live copper wires together barehanded. A massive shock of electricity arced through his body. The current seized his muscles, locking his jaw, filling his vision with a blinding white light. He smelled his own flesh burning. The old scars on his back pulled tight. He didn't let go. He held the connection, forcing the bunker's decaying reactor to dump every ounce of its remaining juice directly into the analog firing mechanisms outside. Through the pont, Kalia felt his agony. It was a searing wall of fire. But underneath the pain, she felt something else. A stubborn, immovable iron will. The will of a man who had decided that today, nobody gets left behind. Suddenly, a new presence flooded the bond. It wasn't Silas's pain. It wasn't Kalia's exhaustion. It was vast. It was curious. It was awake. the child. Silas was thrown backward by a sudden power surge, crashing hard onto the concrete floor. He gasped for air, his lungs refusing to work. His hands were smoking. He looked up at the main terminal. The shattered screen wasn't dead anymore. It was glowing. It wasn't the green of the Alliance. It wasn't the gold of the Valerian. It was a brilliant pulsing silver. Lines of code began to cascade across the cracked glass. It was a language Silas had never seen. It was a fusion, human binary logic seamlessly interwoven with Valerian quantum runes. The bunker groaned. Deep within the bedrock, massive gears began to turn. "What did you do?" Silas coughed, looking at Kalia. Kalia was staring at the screen, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and absolute awe. "It isn't me, Silas. It's him." Outside the bunker, General Thorne stood behind a line of heavy mechanized infantry. The breaching charges were set on the blast doors. "Blow it," Thorne ordered. The engineer pressed the detonator. Nothing happened. The engineer frowned, tapping his console. "Sir, the signal is being jammed. Not just the detonator, everything." Thorne looked down at his wrist comms. The screen was dead. He looked up at the gunship hovering above. Its plasma cannons, which had been glowing bright blue, suddenly powered down the light, dying in the barrels. "What is the meaning of this?" High Priest Valerius demanded, stepping forward, his robes whipping in the wind. "Are your technicians incompetent?" Before Thorne could answer, the ground beneath their feet began to vibrate. Along the ridge surrounding the valley, massive steel plates shifted, throwing off 20 years of dirt and snow. The old Alliance defense turrets rose from their hidden silos, but they didn't look like Alliance turrets anymore. The heavy ballistic barrels were glowing with a strange silver Valerian energy. The child in the bunker wasn't just turning them on, he was upgrading them. He was rewriting the laws of physics, merging the kinetic punch of human engineering with the limitless plasma energy of his mother's bloodline. The turrets didn't aim at the empty sky. They swiveled the gears, whining, and locked directly onto General Thorne's dropship. "Take cover!" Thorne screamed. The ridge erupted. It wasn't a firefight. It was an execution. The hybrid weapons tore through the armored hull of the Alliance cruiser like wet paper. The massive ship shuddered its engines, screaming in protest as the silver plasma chewed through its primary thrusters. Secondary explosions ripped through the fuselage. The cruiser began to list heavily, thick black smoke pouring from its side before it crashed heavily into the far side of the valley, a burning monument to arrogance. Inside the bunker, Silas pulled himself up. He watched the silver code on the screen. He could feel the boy in his mind. The child wasn't angry. He wasn't malicious. He was simply sweeping the board clean to protect his mother. But the effort was too much. The silver light on the screen flickered. The pulse in Silas's mind grew faint. He turned to Kalia. She was unconscious. Her breathing was dangerously slow. "No," Silas muttered, limping over to her. "No, no, no, stay with me." He checked her pulse. It was a flutter. The bunker's reactor was failing. The child had used the last of the facility's power to cripple the fleet. In 5 minutes, Thorne's surviving ground troops would cut through the doors, and there would be nothing left to stop them. Silas looked around the dark freezing room. He saw a grated floor panel leading to the sub-levels, the maintenance shafts. He picked Kalia up. He didn't feel the burns on his hands. He didn't feel the shrapnel in his legs. He kicked the grate aside and carried her down into the belly of the facility. He moved purely on memory, navigating the labyrinth of pipes and conduit. This bunker was a standard Mark IV design. He knew the layout. At the very bottom beneath the reactor room, there was always a high-value extraction tube, a smuggler's exit, a single-occupancy launch pod designed to shoot VOE-1Ps into low orbit during a siege. He kicked open the heavy door to the sub-basement. The pod was there, a rusted bullet-shaped cylinder sitting in a launch rail. It was meant for one person. Silas walked over to it. He pulled the manual release. The hatch popped open with a hiss of stale air. He laid Kalia inside the cramped, padded interior. He strapped the heavy harnesses over her chest and hips. Her eyes fluttered open. She looked at the cramped walls of the pod. She looked at the single seat. She looked at Silas standing outside in the dim red emergency light. "What is this?" she whispered. "A way out," Silas said. His voice was incredibly calm. The trembling in his hands was gone. He reached over to the pod's control panel. He began overriding the launch protocols, punching in the coordinates for the nearest neutral trade station in the sector. Kalia reached out. She grabbed his wrist. Her grip was weak, but her storm gray eyes were suddenly sharp, piercing. "Get in," she said. "It only seats one, Kalia. It only has the life support for one, and you're carrying two. Then we will make it work. Get in, Silas." Silas stopped typing. He looked down at her. He remembered the young recruit on the cruiser Aegis, the face in the glass, the 3 seconds of hesitation. He had spent 5 years punishing himself, believing he was a coward, believing he was broken. He wasn't broken. He had just been waiting for the right moment to pay his debt. "Thorn is going to cut through that door in about 3 minutes, Silas said softly. "When he realizes we aren't in the command center, he'll send his shock troops down here. They'll disable the launch rail before you break atmosphere." "Silas, I have to stay. I have to blow the primary geothermal core. It'll collapse the entire facility, the valley, everything. It's the only way to make sure they can't follow you." Kalia's eyes filled with tears. "You will die." "I died 5 years ago, Kalia. I've just been walking around waiting to fall over." He reached out and gently touched her cheek. His rough, calloused thumb wiped away a tear. "Go," Silas whispered. "Your people need you. Your world needs you. You have to lead them." Kalia stared at him. The royal commander, the supreme heir. She looked at the man who tasted of ash and grease, the man who had carried her across a dead world. Through the bond, she didn't send him fear. She didn't send him sorrow. She sent him absolute, immovable defiance. Kalia reached up with both hands. She grabbed the heavy canvas straps of her harness. She hit the quick release buckle. "What are you doing?" Silas asked, his eyes widening. Kalia hauled herself out of the pool. She stumbled, her legs weak, but she didn't fall. She leaned heavily against the rusted metal of the launch tube. She reached up and grabbed the heavy iron collar of her royal armor, the crest of the Valerian dynasty. She ripped it off. She let the heavy gold and silver clasp clatter to the concrete floor. She grabbed Silas by the front of his tactical shirt, pulling him close until she could feel his breath on her face. "My world," Kalia said, her voice dropping to a fierce guttural whisper, "is right here." Silas stared at her. "You're throwing away an empire." "I am choosing a family." She pressed her forehead against his chest. "If you stay, I stay. We burn together, or we leave together." Through the bond, Silas felt the absolute truth of her words. There was no hesitation, no calculation, only a terrifying, profound devotion. He looked at the open pine. He looked at the heavy steel door behind them. He could hear the faint, muffled thud of breaching charges detonating on the upper levels. "It's a one-man pod," Silas said, his voice cracking. "The G-force on launch. Without a crash seat, it will crush my ribs." "Then I will hold you together," she said. Silas looked at her. He nodded once. "Get in," he said. Kalia climbed back into the narrow seat. Silas didn't strap her in. He squeezed himself into the pod, practically sitting on her lap, his back pressed against the heavy steel hatch. There was barely room to breathe. The air was instantly stifling. He reached his scarred, blistered arm out of the pod, his fingers wrapping around the manual launch lever. But he didn't pull it yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy multi-tool. He flicked it open. He reached down to the exposed wiring of the pod's umbilical cord, the line that connected to the bunker's main reactor. "Silas," Kalia asked, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist in the dark. "I said I was going to blow the core." Silas grunted. "I never said I had to be standing next to it." He jammed the steel multi-tool across the positive and negative terminals of the umbilical feed. A massive, unnatural surge of feedback shot down the line, straight into the bunker's unstable geothermal heart. "Hold on," Silas roared. He slammed his hand on the launch lever, pulling the hatch shut at the exact same moment. The world turned into fire and noise. The launch rail engaged with a violent, spine-snapping jolt. The pod shot upward through the long, dark tube at a terrifying speed. The G-force hit Silas like a physical wall of concrete. The air was driven from his lungs. He felt a rib crack under the pressure, a sharp, white-hot agony in his side. He couldn't breathe. The darkness of the pod pressed in on him. But beneath him, he felt Kalia's arms holding him tight. Her strength, her presence in his mind kept the darkness from pulling him under. Far below them, the bunker's core achieved critical mass. The explosion didn't just destroy the facility. It fractured the bedrock of the valley. A dome of silent, blinding white light expanded across the surface of the dead planet, vaporizing General Thorn High Priest Valerius and the remnants of both their forces in a fraction of a second. The Drachnid swarm drawn by the noise was turned to ash before they even knew what hit them. The pod broke the atmosphere, shooting out into the cold, silent void of space like a bullet fleeing a murder scene. Inside the tiny dark cabin, the G-force slowly faded as they hit zero gravity. Silas gasped for air. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. His chest was wet with his own blood. He rested his head against the cold steel of the hatch. "We made it," he whispered into the dark. He felt Kalia's hand reach up and rest gently on his cheek. "We made it, mechanic." Through the bond, the third heartbeat pulsed. Steady, strong, safe. They were alive. They had no army, no home, no titles. The Alliance would brand them traitors. The Valerian would brand them heretics. They could never return to the worlds they knew. Silas closed his eyes, listening to the hum of the pod's small engine, carrying them into the deep unknown. It was the best trade he had ever made.
Ifatan.
5 years later, the planet of Oakhaven was a backwater rock on the absolute edge of the outer rim. It wasn't a strategic military point. It had no rare minerals. It was mostly red dust, scrub brush, and endless pale blue skies. The wind blew constantly. It rattled the corrugated tin roof of the small, solitary farmhouse sitting in the middle of a massive, arid valley. In the yard, Silas Vance lay on his back in the dirt. He was older. The gray had taken over the sides of his hair. His face was weathered, deeply lined by the harsh sun and the unforgiving wind. He wore a stained canvas jacket and heavy work boots. He grunted, his breath catching in a wet, heavy cough that never entirely went away. The G-force of the P and the radiation of the bunker had left their permanent mark on his lungs. Some days were worse than others. He reached up with a heavy wrench, tightening a bolt on the underside of a rusted moisture evaporator. His hands were covered in old grease and thick white scars, but his left hand was perfectly, absolutely still. "Torque is off," Silas muttered to himself, adjusting his grip. A shadow fell over him, blocking the harsh sun. Silas rolled out from under the machine. Kalia stood there. She wore a simple, faded linen dress that fell to her ankles, a heavy woven shawl pulled over her shoulders against the wind. Her silver hair was tied back in a messy braid. Her lavender skin was dusted with red dirt. She had no armor, no crown, no guards. She held a battered tin mug in her hand. Steam rose from it. She looked down at him. The royal commander turned frontier farmer. A profound, quiet peace rested in her storm-gray eyes. "You have been under there for 3 hours, Silas," she said. Her voice still held that melodic resonance, but it was softer now. Worn comfortable like an old leather glove. "Pump valve is stuck," Silas said, sitting up and wiping the sweat from his forehead with the back of his arm. He took the mug from her. "Thanks." He took a sip. It was cheap, bitter chicory root. It was hot. It was perfect. He looked up at her. He didn't need the bond to know what she was feeling. The psychic link was still there, a quiet hum in the background of their minds, but they rarely used it for words anymore. They had learned the quiet language of a shared life. "Where is he?" Silas asked, taking another sip. Kalia turned and looked toward the edge of the property where the scrub brush met the rocky foothills. She smiled, a soft, genuine expression. "He is practicing," she said. Silas stood up his knee, popping loudly. He put a hand on his lower back, stretching out the stiffness. He walked over to stand beside his wife. About 50 yards away, a young boy was sitting cross-legged in the red dirt. He had messy, unruly brown hair that constantly fell into his eyes. He wore patched denim overalls. But his skin had a faint iridescent hue under the sun, and his eyes were the color of a gathering storm. The boy Leo was staring intently at a pile of rocks in front of him. He didn't touch them. He just stared. Slowly, a heavy, jagged rock the size of a melon began to levitate. It floated a few inches off the ground, trembling slightly. The boy's face scrunched up in deep concentration. Silas chuckled, a low, rasping sound. His telekinesis is getting stronger. Yesterday, it was just pebbles. "He has my focus," Kalia said proudly. "He has my stubbornness." Silas countered. The boy lost his concentration. The rock dropped like a lead weight, kicking up a puff of red dust. Leo let out an exasperated sigh, his shoulders slumping. He kicked the dirt with his small boot. Then he looked up. He saw his parents standing by the vaporizer. The frustration vanished from his face. A wide, gap-toothed smile broke out. He jumped to his feet. He didn't use any alien powers. He just ran. He ran as fast as his small legs could carry him, kicking up a trail of dust, his arms pumping. Silas set the tin mug down on the rusted metal casing of the machine. He knelt down in the dirt, opening his arms. Leo hit him like a small cannonball, throwing his arms around Silas's neck. Silas grunted, wrapping his scarred hands around the boy, burying his face in his son's dusty hair. He smelled like ozone and dried leaves. "Hey, buddy," Silas whispered, his voice thick. Kalia knelt down beside them, wrapping her arms around both of them. The wind howled across the barren plains of Oakhaven. The galaxy was vast, filled with empires, wars, titles, and endless politics. Somewhere out there, the Alliance and the Valerian were likely still searching for them. Silas didn't care. He closed his eyes. He held his wife. He held his son. He felt the solid, unforgiving dirt beneath his boots. He was just a mechanic, and his universe was exactly where it belonged.